Hi, it is Wednesday, July 15th, 2009. My name is Ellie Gettinger, and I am talking with Jody Hirsh as part of the Video History Project of the Jewish Museum, Milwaukee. Jody, could you start by kind of giving me a sense of your family's background?
My family's background. Well, my parents were both born here in America. My mother in Detroit, my father just outside of Pittsburgh. My father's family came from Lithuania. They were all Yiddish speakers. And I never actually knew his parents. They died even before he was married. But they settled in a little town outside of Pittsburgh called Carnegie, Pennsylvania. And my mother's family came from Hungary. And both of them came to America more than 100 years ago. So they came way before World War II. They weren't immigrants from World War II, but they came around the turn of the last century.
And what were your parents' professions?
Well, my mother, when she was young, was a secretary. And when she married my dad, she was a housewife. But then, when I was about 15 or so, she actually went back to school to get a BA. She was like the oldest person in her class. It's like one of those TV programs. There was a program with Gertrude Berg of Molly Goldberg called Mrs. G Goes to College. So that was around the same time as my mother going off to college. So
Mrs. H goes to college.
Mrs. H goes to college, and she had all these friends who were, undergraduates, and then she got a degree in education, taught for a while, and then got a master's degree in counseling and became a guidance counselor. So this was an entire career that, was brand new.
Mm-hmm.
And it was we were all very proud of her because I lived in a community when the wives were housewives and didn't really think about going off to other professions. My dad had a lumber yard, and it was a tough business, but that's the only business. That was the family business. And
his father had been on the lumber
his
yard?
father had some involvement in the lumber yard, and this particular lumber yard was formed by my father and his brother and two sisters. They went into business together to create this lumber yard, Hirsh Lumber and Supply Company in Carnegie, Pennsylvania.
What was the Jewish population of Carnegie?
Carnegie, I don't know. I think it was there were a few families. There was a small Orthodox shul, which interestingly enough is still there. There aren't any Jews that live in Carnegie anymore. But it's become an Orthodox Sephardic shul that has mostly Israelis. It's so bizarre, to me to think about it. But there were a handful of families, and I remember going there once with my Aunt Jean, my father's sister. All of them grew up there, and they called her, she was already married, her name was Leipzig, and they called her Miss Hirsh still in this little town because the Hirsh family was up on the hill in a big house, and it was a kind of aristocratic Jewish family in this small, not very Jewish town. It was very interesting.
So then, but when you were growing up, you didn't grow up in Carnegie?
I didn't. When I was 5 years old, we moved away, and we went to another suburb of Pittsburgh, Mount Lebanon, which is a very kind of affluent suburb. There weren't very many Jews that lived there either, but that meant that we Jewish kids, and the Jewish families in general, were very tight-knit.
What do you say in that milieu you experienced anti-Semitism?
Not exactly, although I heard stories. I mean, one of my friends' father was a tailor and furrier in Mount Lebanon, and he told stories of the Ku Klux Klan, burning crosses in his lawn. I'd never quite experienced that. Every once in a while, there was a teacher that I had in high school that was clearly an anti-Semite, and he would tell, he was a football coach and a history teacher. And
always an interesting combination.
He didn't know history very well, but I was careful not to correct him. But he would say things like, "Okay, when you grade these papers, I want you to do the Christian thing and be honest about it." And he would look like straight at me when he said that. And I also remember when I was a kid. I mean, not that I don't think my whole life I've ever been seriously affected by anti-Semitism, but I certainly saw it around us. And I remember there was this one little gated community, a suburb of a picture called Virginia Manor. And we would particularly drive through there at Christmas time because they had the most amazing Christmas lights. It was very affluent, gated. And there was this little tiny sign that was out in front of the front gate. It was like that big, and it said, a restricted community. And that only meant one thing. It meant no Jews. I mean,
or blacks.
No, it didn't mean blacks, because no black in those days, in the 50s,
Uh-huh.
would have had the effrontery to even think about moving into that area. So that was his phrase in its day that meant only no Jews, even though it was just assumed that no blacks, would move in, and it was before there were any Latinos really in Pittsburgh. But and I've carried that with me always. And it's such a different world today,
Mm-hmm.
because really we're not. I mean, people might not like us in some neighborhoods. I won't name any, but in Milwaukee, but nobody would even attempt to bar us from any particular neighborhoods.
So as far as, growing up with this tightly knit Jewish community in Mount Lebanon, was your family involved in synagogues or in youth groups? How did the family Jewish life look?
My parents were founding members of Temple Emmanuel of the South Hills. And I don't really remember it when I was 5 very well, but we met in a church. In fact, my bar mitzvah was in a church. And although by then we were building our building, which was still there, and it became a fairly large synagogue. Now Mount Lebanon has a very large Jewish population, but it didn't really when I was growing up there. I was very active in youth group. It was a really important thing to me, and I think really it's the core of how it ended up that I ended up in Jewish education. I was a Reform congregation. I was very active in NIFTY. I was a regional officer. I went to all these big national conferences. And I think it really did influence my whole Jewish sense of myself. And we were very active, in our synagogue. It's funny, my parents, after all of this, I have a brother and a sister, and after we all were out of Pittsburgh, had graduated, we were off on our own, suddenly my parents just stopped going to the synagogue. They went every single Friday night. And they brought us with them for family services. And when we came home from college, we went with our parents always to Temple. And my parents just stopped going. And I think they didn't even belong anymore. And I was like so shocked. And I finally talked to my mother about it. She said, well, we just thought that was what we were supposed to do. This was the 50s. I grew up in the 50s. And I remember these TV service advertisements, public service advertisements that talked about attend the church or synagogue of your choice. And that was, my parents just felt as responsible parents, that's what they needed to do, but it didn't mean as much to them. I mean, it means much more to me, so that's the thing that's
So you grew up in this very Jewish household, but it was kind of something that they were putting on for
Yeah,
you
but,
guys.
well, it wasn't. I mean, it was very Jewish. I mean, their friends were only Jewish. My grandparents on both sides, including the ones I never met, were Orthodox. And so, but they had they rejected the intensity of the Orthodox religion. And I would say it was a very Jewish home. And I don't think my parents had any friends who weren't Jewish. But it was the ritual that really, I guess, was more superficial than I thought. I mean, it was great, but it just kind of was a surprise.
So as far as you had this your experience in NIFTY provided you with kind of a pathway towards Jewish education. Can you describe your Jewish education to us?
Well, certainly. I think that the one thing in NIFTY that influenced me more than anything else was its connection to Israel. And so I guess I was a Zionist before I even knew what that was. And really, I was born in 1947, in May of 1947. So that was a year after, the year before the State of Israel was, it came into being. And I think my whole life I've made that connection. I am a year older than the State of Israel. And I think from as long as I can remember, that's been something important to me. So on the one hand, I was born before Israel became a state, but on the other hand, I don't remember. I don't remember any world without a State of Israel in it. And so my temple was interesting. I was in special Hebrew, which meant we had Sunday school, but I went to Hebrew class twice a week, not just once. And I was really.
Was that a personal decision?
It was a personal decision. My parents really, I don't think that mattered to them. We went to Sunday school, and it was something that was really important to me, although ironically, we studied Ashkenazic Hebrew. which isn't the Hebrew that's spoken in Israel. So, in fact, they used an Israeli textbook called Ivrit Chaya, which means living Hebrew. Maybe you had the same book. I mean, it was used for a generation, really. And but we didn't pronounce it Ivrit Chaya. We pronounced it Ivris Chayo. And it was just so odd because it was modern Hebrew, conversational Hebrew, but with this kind of
Was your
Ashkenazi.
teacher an Ashkenazi, an old guard?
Well, the original one was, but then I remember for the years around my bar mitzvah, there was this young teacher who was a medical student in Pittsburgh who was teaching, and he also was my bar mitzvah tutor. And I remember him, he interviewed for a job at Camp Ramah, and he came back and he was getting very mixed up between the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic, because he learned Sephardic also, you know, so it was very interesting. But I was always interested, and then I really studied Hebrew on my own, and I really worked on the Sephardic accent, and then when I graduated from high school, I went to Israel on a NIFTY program. The NIFTY is the National Federation of Temple Youth. It's the Reform Youth Movement. You know, this was in 1965. It was the Peace Corps was really big, and NIFTY created this thing that they called the Mitzvah Corps, which was like a Peace Corps in Israel. And I was in the first group of kids that went over there. I was 18, so I was among the older of those kids. But it was a really amazing experience.
What did you do?
We worked in this little town called Tirat Carmel. It's just south of Haifa, and we lived. Each of us, there were 20 of us, I believe. We each lived with an Israeli family. We had Hebrew classes every day, and in the afternoons we worked in the public gardens of this town. They were creating this kind of public park garden. We worked in the gardens, you know, at first kind of plowing and removing stones, and then later on planting and watering. And it was a really amazing experience, and because we lived with these Israeli families, it was. I'm very grateful for that experience. It was. We weren't tourists exactly, although there was a certain amount of tourism, and we traveled around the country. But it was a really significant program that you lived with a family, you got to know them, you were forced to speak Hebrew because most of these families didn't speak English, and you worked in the little town.
So by the end of the year, you were fluent.
I
Functionally fluent.
Sort of functionally fluent. That's a good term. Yes, and then. That was after I graduated from high school. So then I went to the University of Wisconsin, actually in Madison, so I started by taking second year Hebrew because I had enough Hebrew that it was exempt from first year Hebrew.
What was Madison like in the 1960s?
Well, you know what? It's really when I came here in 1998. I went to Madison and. It was exactly the same and really different at the same time. But of course, in 1965, it was a hotbed of student radical activity. It's where the Committee to End the War in Vietnam was created. Mm-hmm. I was involved in Jewish things. In those days, I thought I wanted to study psychology, and you know, Harlow was there with the monkey boxes and all of that. And I ended up eventually majoring in Hebrew, but it was an amazing time to be there, you know, the whole political engagement of a huge part of the student body. But I was also really active in Hillel, and I really wanted Hebrew in Israel, and I already knew when I went there as a freshman that my junior year was going to be in Israel. So that was an important thing. And again, I think, as I said before, I think my whole career in Jewish education really kind of focused on the Israel thing more than anything else, and Hebrew. I just felt like I resonated with Hebrew.
So in terms of your political activity, it was mostly directed to Jewish causes within the
No, not really. I mean, the whole committee, the Vietnam thing, I mean, that was very big, you know, demonstrating against the war in Vietnam, and I remember there was a big, there were demonstrations about different companies that produced napalm and other chemicals and things that were used in the war. So it was a very activist thing. But you know, and again, my friends were all involved as radicals. I was kind of more moderate as a radical, I have to admit. I remember one time when this is when maybe I was a sophomore. I don't remember exactly when this was. But Ted Kennedy came to speak. He spoke at the Cow Palace in Madison. And the audience was unbelievably rude. There were all the students, and they jeered him. They wouldn't let him talk. And I just felt so embarrassed by that. I mean, I really sided with the sentiments of the anti-war movement, but I felt that this isn't the way to get things done. And I remember I actually wrote Kennedy a letter, which he responded. Now, who knows if it was really him? You know, it had his signature on it. But so I was always kind of like, I was never in the center of the radicalness. And Hillel was a kind of a really interesting ballast. It's where I first discovered more traditional Judaism, having grown up Reform. I became very active in Hillel, and I led services, and even during the riots in Madison, we set up Hillel as a first aid station, and they had classes about how to make these little kind of gas masks out of paper cups and charcoal. And I mean, this was at Hillel, you know, sponsored by Hillel. So those were very vivid years, I have to say.
That sounds very vivid. So was your junior abroad 1967?
It was 1967, so the 67 war was in June, and I got there at the end of July. So,
what was the sentiment in Israel like at that point after the 6-Day War?
You know what? I seem to be in certain places at certain times like that I feel very grateful for. First of all, the pride of Israelis that they won this war in 6 days was unbelievable, and the pride of us as the Jewish people in general, you know, because it was such an amazing thing. But at the same time, they used to talk about an enlightened occupation. Kibush na'or, they said. It was an enlightened occupation. Because when it's odd, because when I was there, I had to have some neurosurgery, and I spent time in the hospital. And the hospital was full of Arabs.
Where was the hospital?
The Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. Not the new one on Mount Scopus, but the old one. And the hospital, the clinics were full of Arabs who, for the first time in their life, were entitled to medical care. And the Israelis were really proud of that. They were proud of the fact that they might be an occupying force, but it was an enlightened occupying force, and they were, they were providing education and health care that the people didn't have when they were part of Jordan. And it was amazing. I mean, I think that there were certain people at that time. One of them was Professor Leibovitz, Yeshayahu Leibovitz, who was a philosophy professor and a science professor, and he said that this occupation will corrupt us. And in my opinion, he was right. But that was kind of the minority opinion in those days. And so the combination, the kind of pride that Israelis felt. And also, that was only 20 years after the State of Israel. In fact, I was there for the 20th Yom HaAtzmaut parade. It was one of the last Yom HaAtzmaut parades that they ever had. And, it was different. Now that Israel is 61, it feels very different. That was only 20 years old. I mean, everybody there practically, certainly people my age, remembered way back at the very beginnings of it. So it was a pretty amazing experience. And we had choices about what kind of dormitories we lived in. In those days, the university was at Givat Ram. It wasn't on Mount Scopus, of course.
This is Hebrew University.
The Hebrew University. And so most of the American students stayed on Givat Ram. There was a whole little enclave of American and foreign students. And I lived in Kiryat Yovel. So my neighbors were mostly Israelis. And I did that on purpose because I thought, I'm in Israel. I want to speak Hebrew every day. And I want to get to know Israelis. And my best friends, I still have friends to this day from those years. But I just wanted to immerse myself into as much Israeli society as possible. I took a lot of regular courses. There were special courses in Easy Hebrew and courses in English for foreign students. And I took mostly regular courses, including literature courses. And it was so much work because my Hebrew wasn't quite good enough. it ended up really good. But at the beginning, in fact, recently I was looking through some of my books, and I had an old Hebrew literature anthology that's from those years. And I used to use green ink, and every time there was a word I didn't know, I underlined the word and I wrote the meaning of the word in English in the margin. And I looked at this book, and like the margins were just full of all these words that I didn't know. And it's like I don't remember not knowing those words, you know. So
but this is the way you discovered them.
Right. This is the way I discovered them, and it was just total immersion. And I feel very grateful for that experience. I think that's certainly one of the real highlights of my life is that year.
Did you ever consider making Aliyah?
Of course, you know, like all the time, you know, and I still think about it on occasion, even though, like, you know, I'll never be able to retire. None of us baby boomers will be able to afford to retire. But you know, so off and on, certainly over the years. But you know, I'm in Jewish education. Jewish educators are a dime a dozen, and I also, you know, feel that I have a mission, you know, and I think that I'm more valuable here in Jewish education. Although I have given thought to what someone like me could help with as far as the secular school system and Jewish education in the secular school system. I have given that some thought. But meanwhile, I'm here in America.
So, since what do you feel like your educational mission is?
You know what? I think, first of all, I'm right now, for the last long time, I've been in the JCC field. I think it's so totally the field for me. I have taught in synagogues. I taught for LA Hebrew High School when I was living in Los Angeles. That was the conservative movement. And I like teaching in general, but I love the fact that the JCC is a place where pluralism is played out. And that's one of the challenges. How do I create educational programs that really reflect the pluralism of the community? So I would say that the central part of my mission isn't to bring people into a form of Judaism that reflects my own form. I want my students to think, to examine. You know, I always say, for example, when I teach about kashrut, for example, in the basic Judaism class, I say, you know what, keep kosher, don't keep kosher. It's not up to me, it's up to you. But don't you dare not keep kosher just as a kind of default. Make a decision based on understanding what that is, and then you decide, is that valuable to you or not? You know, whereas other people would say, no, God wants you to keep kosher, this is what you need to do, and I'm going to teach you how to do this. But I really believe that I want to help people think about themselves as Jews, no matter what it is that I'm teaching, whether it's a literature class or whether it's a religion class or a history class, it doesn't matter. I want them to see, how does this resonate with you, and what does this have to do with your identity, and how does this help you make choices in your life as a Jew? That's what my mission is.
And you have like this breadth of knowledge about kind of all things Jewish, but if you had to say, you know, what you feel your expertise is, where would you?
Well, you know, I have a master's degree, and I started a doctoral program, but never finished the dissertation, and my field is modern Hebrew literature. So I think in general, literature is what I'm most passionate about. Even the way I teach Bible is really teaching the Bible as literature. And kind of in general is the arts. I'm also a musician, and I'm also a playwright, and I really feel that the arts are the common denominator of all Jews. I mean, the arts and culture. That is the set of the Jewish people. And actually, I know that there are people who disagree with me, but I really think that religion is the subset. Maybe it isn't in that everything grew out of the religion, but if you look at the majority of the Jewish people, they're mostly not religious, but they're all part of Jewish culture in some way or another. So I really, and that's one of my struggles at the JCC. I really want to, I want to just increase the way we use the arts in the JCC and the way we use Jewish culture, because I think that is something that everyone can relate to.
As far as your own art, can you tell us about your plays?
Sure. You know what? It's funny because when I was a teenager, and even as an undergraduate, I was really involved in theater, primarily as an actor. Although when I was in Madison, I also taught at Bethel at the Reformed congregation there, and I wrote a lot of plays for children, I really thought of myself as an actor, but you know what? I just didn't have what it takes. I don't know if I have the talent to be a good actor, but certainly I didn't have the drive to really push yourself to go to those unbelievably awful auditions, you know, and take rejection all the time. I mean, but then, you know, at one point I was the assistant director of the Bureau of Jewish Education in San Francisco. And there was a big change, and they had a new director, and there was a lot of downsizing, and I lost my job. And I got another, like it was a 3/4 time job, but I thought, you know what, I have a little extra time, and I always thought of myself as a writer, and so I wanted to do it. So I started writing really seriously. So I've written a lot of theater. I wrote one play with the San Francisco Mime Troupe. And it was a slapstick musical comedy about the first Intifada. And
unusual topic.
Unusual topic. I mean, the mime troupe doesn't do mime; they do satirical musical comedies, and usually with a political kind of message. And it was an amazing, amazing experience. Actually, there were 4 of us who wrote it together. There was the writer who writes for the mime troupe. There was an Israeli playwright. Sinai Petter, the writer, the mime troupe writer is Joan Holden, Sinai Petter, and then there was Emily Shihadeh, who was a Palestinian stand-up comedian. I always used to tell her she was the only Palestinian I knew with a sense of humor. And so the 4 of us got together to write this, and we had 2 rules. Number 1, it had to be funny. No matter what it was, it had to be funny. And number 2, we had to make a commitment to finish the play, no matter what. And it wasn't always easy. I remember one discussion we had for 4 hours, an argument about one line in the play. And, you know, but we managed to write this play that I'm actually very proud of. And the whole message of the play is try and understand this story from the other side point of view. And it won an Obie Award, which is a big New York award for OB means off-Broadway. So we won the award as, for that year, 1989, as the best regional theater production.
Have you thought about doing an update for?
We did it during the second Intifada. We did an update of it. It's been performed a few times. It's had 2 United States national tours and 1 international tour. It performed in Israel, and it got great reviews even in Israel.
In English or in Hebrew?
In English. So that was one big show. I wrote it. I've written a few shows along the way, you know, that have had professional productions. When I lived in Israel, I wrote what has become really Israel's longest-running play. It is an interactive murder mystery event that they do at the David's Tower Museum in Jerusalem. So they do it twice a week, once on Wednesday nights in Hebrew and on Saturday nights in English. And they also, tourist groups can book it for their group during the day or whenever they come to tour this museum. So it was quite an amazing experience because the play it's called The Great King Herod Murder Mystery. And it's about an actual murder during the time of King Herod. And it's in a fortress that was built by King Herod more than 2,000 years ago. So just creating this play and walking around this fortress to figure out where it was I was going to, put the different scenes was just quite an amazing experience.
That's very cool.
I also wrote a play. I lived in Hong Kong, and I lived there during the handover, so I wrote a play for the handover. There was also an interactive murder mystery that was, it takes place in 1904, during the inauguration of Hong Kong's first and only Jewish governor, Matthew Nathan. So it was a whole murder mystery surrounding
his inauguration,
in which we actually reenacted the inauguration. All of the audience wore period clothing. It was the most amazing thing.
Oh, wow.
And I tried to be, I even did the research, and my actor, who was Matthew Nathan, he gave his speech. The speech was really long. I cut it down to about 3 minutes, but it was the real words of Matthew Nathan, and it was very cool.
So how did you end up in Hong Kong?
Oh my! Well, that's
That's
a long story, but it's a great story. I was working at the JCC in Houston, Texas, And I often would be in my office until like in the middle of the night because it was a really great time. It was quiet, no one bothered you, the phone didn't ring. And I came home at like 2 in the morning, and my little light was flashing on my telephone answering machine. And I listened to it, and there was this guy calling me from Hong Kong. He said, "You don't know me, but I'm so-and-so, and I just talked to so-and-so in New York, who was another Jewish educator, and I need to talk to you right away." Now, I had no idea what time it was in Hong Kong, but I figured it's probably daytime if it's 2 in the morning in Houston. So I called, and the guy starts telling me about this the Jewish community in Hong Kong, about how over 100 years earlier, one of the wealthy Jews, Sassoon, from the Sephardic Sassoon family, they purchased property in the middle of nowhere in Hong Kong, halfway up Mount Victoria, and they built a synagogue. It's really the middle of nowhere, and they had this land, and they had a parsonage for the rabbi, and they had a Jewish recreational club. But it was a huge plot of land, and that same part of Hong Kong is now probably the most affluent area in Hong Kong with these very high-rise luxury buildings. So like the year or two before this phone call, someone got the bright idea of leasing part of this land to a developer on a 99-year lease. And the developer was going to build this twin towers, 45 stories, 650 units in these towers, residential towers. But the lower 5 stories of one of the towers part of the deal was it was going to be dedicated as a Jewish community center. And the Jewish community got a huge undisclosed amount of money for this deal. Some say it was as much as $350 million, so making it really the most wealthy Jewish community. It's just unbelievable. And so they were creating this Jewish community center. It wasn't built yet, and they were talking about how they were around talking maybe for an hour and a half with this guy, and finally he says to me, "So what do you think?" And I said, "What do you mean, what do I think?" He says, "Do you want the job?" I said, "What job?" He said, "Do you want to be the program director of the Hong Kong JCC?" And I said, "No." I'm not interested. I didn't think I was going to be in Houston forever, but I had my eyes on New York and maybe the national organization. So he said, "Well, could you send us your resume?" And I said, "Listen to me, I don't want this job." And he said, No, I just want to show people here what the resume of a professional Jewish educator is like." So I said, "Okay," so I sent him my resume. Then he calls me and says, "Why don't you come here for a visit? We'll pay all your expenses for 2 weeks." And I said, "Listen to me, I'm not interested in this job. I don't want to move to Hong Kong." He said, "Doesn't matter, there's no strings attached." I said, "Listen, I'd stupid if I refused a free trip to Hong Kong, but you just have to know I'm not going to take this job." Because really and truly, I never was interested in Asia. My traveling was either Middle East or Europe, my languages or Hebrew and European languages. I just wasn't interested. They brought me there. I remember I went to my boss in Houston and I said, "Listen, they're ringing me, they're really pressuring me to take this job. There's no chance I'm going to take the job, but I want to go to Hong Kong." So I went. I fell in love with Hong Kong almost the moment I got there. It was the most amazing place. It was so vital. The community is unbelievable. We spoke 17 languages at the JCC in Hong Kong. There are Jews from France, from Italy, from Denmark, from Sweden, from South America, from Israel. I mean, it was, and so it was such an amazing place, and it was such potential to touch lives that I ended up saying yes, almost on the spot. It was just the most amazing experience. So I ended up moving to Hong Kong. It was kind of odd. I think it's a very hard community to work. The people in charge are the trustees of the community. They're very aristocratic, wealthy, mostly Jews with Baghdadi heritage. Some of them had been knighted by the Queen, or the King actually beforehand,
Wow.
It was a very hard. The sort of aristocracy didn't really get involved with the Jewish community, but this money belonged to the Jewish community, but it was pretty amazing. Most of the Jews there were expats. They were posted there by their companies. They lived from all over. A lot of times they would just be there for 2 or 3 years. So I saw people come and go while I was there, but it was an amazing opportunity. It was just.
How long were you there for?
I was there for 3 years, and then just after the handover, they decided to discontinue, the trustees decided to discontinue the program department. The membership was up in arms, and they particularly wanted me because I had really created this really vital thing going on there. But they just closed it, so there's no program department anymore at all. And I have to admit, I feel a little angry still because I just built so many things. But they saw all this activity and they thought, well, it's just a natural thing. People come to the JCC, and they didn't realize it was because of what I built. You know, and then I was so I came back to America. I was offered a few jobs, and the one in Milwaukee really seemed to suit me. So here I am in Milwaukee. Walk on, Milwaukee.
So what have been your impressions of the city since you've been here about 10 years?
Oh, I've been here 11 years, 10 and a half years. I'll tell you, it's a good city to work in, and I came from Hong Kong, there are 5 congregations in Hong Kong, 4 Orthodox and 1 Reform. They all hate each other. I always say it's because every Jew needs 4 shuls they refuse to set foot in. It was very hard. I mean, I was like a shuttle diplomat. I mean, I think everyone trusted me, but they didn't trust each other.
Could you belong to any of these congregations?
I belonged to 2 congregations. I belonged to sort of the classic Orthodox one, Ohelea synagogue. And I belonged to the Reformed congregation also. And it was quite, I mean, it was just an amazing place. But, but there, the Orthodox Reform, I mean, they were kind of at each other's throats. I remember the first program I did there was a Purim program, and I went to the Reform, and they said, we don't want to be part of a community program. The Orthodox hate us. And I said, no, this will be great. Everyone will do this together. And then I went to the Orthodox, and they said, we don't want to be there because the Reform are going to be part of it. And, and I really created this thing where everyone worked together, but it was very contentious. And I'm telling you that coming to Milwaukee, where, I mean, everyone has their agenda, but people work together. The Orthodox rabbis in this town will call the Reform rabbis rabbi. Even a woman rabbi, they'll call rabbi. That wouldn't happen. I mean, the Orthodox rabbis made a point of calling the Reform rabbis Mr., or just using their first name. They would never utter that word rabbi. So, and I'm sure that people have their idea of different standards for what constitutes a rabbi, but in this town, people give each other the respect I think that everyone deserves. So that's a really great thing. And the other thing about Milwaukee that I think really is true statistically is that we have, I think we have a higher percentage of people who are really engaged in the Jewish community than are most other communities, and I find that very appealing. And the whole kind of Zionist underpinnings too really appeals to me. So I think that there are a lot of really great things about Milwaukee. I know it's often hard to get professionals to move here to Milwaukee, but I think it's a great town, and it's a great community.
Going back, actually, since you just said Zionists in Milwaukee, that underpinning, you were in Israel when Golda was prime minister.
I was.
Do you have any remembrances of Miss Prime Minister Meyer?
I do. I remember the first time I heard her on the radio in Israel. I was with an Israeli friend, and she spoke Hebrew with an American accent, but she had this really kind of grovelly voice, and a lot of it was affected by the fact that she chain smoked like a chimney. She always had a cigarette in her hand, and she had this gravelly voice. So I was with an Israeli friend, and we were listening, and it sounded, and because in Hebrew, the verb can be masculine or feminine. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was a man speaking with this gravelly voice, saying, Ani choshevet, I think, but think is feminine, and it sounded, and I was with this Israeli friend, so at first we thought, well, this is an American immigrant who really doesn't speak Hebrew that well, because it's a man who's using the feminine form of the word, and then suddenly my friend looked at me and said, that's Golda. It's like I didn't recognize her voice. So that was a pretty amazing experience. So I certainly remember. I've never met her personally, but certainly I feel like I had.
Here's what are you most proud of?
I'm really proud of my life experience. It's not that I haven't made mistakes, and it's not that I haven't had painful times, but I just think that I always move on. It's interesting. One time when I was in Israel, someone had a birthday party, a friend of mine, and it was a 1960s birthday party in Israel. So everyone's supposed to come dressed as though they were in the 1960s, and then there was a point where everyone sat around and people were supposed to talk about their impressions of the 1960s. So we all had impressions. We were all about the same age. And I was struck by the fact that all these people, in a certain way, were kind of stuck in the 1960s. And I think that's one thing about me is I've always just moved on. I mean, I have great nostalgia about the 60s. I have great nostalgia about when I lived in Israel. But I always move on. I don't feel like I need to go back at any time, and I don't regret it. And I've always moved on. So, and I like that. So I really think that I've been influential with so many students. I used to teach high school when I was in Los Angeles, and I'm in touch with students from my whole career. I've been an influence. I really, and again, my mission is to help people think about who they are as Jews, and I think I've done that. So I think I'm really proud of that. I'm also kind of proud of the fact that I've lived all over the world.
Israel, Hong Kong,
Israel, Hong Kong. I lived in Indonesia briefly. When I finished Israel, I just wanted to take time out, and I lived in Bali in Indonesia for a few months. I lived in Montreal, where I spoke French, and such as it is in Montreal, and I've lived in Israel, of course, and I kind of feel like I'm a citizen of the world, and I like that. And it's odd. I feel like I don't really have a home. Pittsburgh isn't my home anymore, where I grew up. My parents don't live there. Israel is kind of a home that I feel very comfortable in there. I love Hong Kong. I love Bali. I feel like I'm homeless in a certain way, but it doesn't make me feel bad. It makes me feel really good. I love the fact that you can plop me down in London or Paris or Montreal or Los Angeles or Hong Kong or New York, and I know exactly where to go and how to do things, and I speak languages. I remember one time I read a story by Good-Loved Parrots, and one of the characters was this kind of international character, and one of his lines was, he says, "I wore languages like gloves." I love that metaphor. I aspire to that. I don't know enough languages, and at my age, it's getting harder to learn languages. But it's something that I aspire to still. So I don't feel like I have a home, but I think that's part of something that I'm proud of. That I'm so comfortable everywhere.
What do you see the future of Milwaukee Jewish community beyond the Jewish people in general? What's your sense?
You know what? I think. There have been times in Jewish history where there have been incredible changes in which the Jewish people had to totally change their sense of themselves in order to deal with living in the world. I think that one of those changes, it's a paradigm shift really, is when the Romans destroyed the temple finally. Our religion today is nothing like the religion of 2,000 years ago. We don't do sacrifices, we don't have priests, all of that. This is study is important for everyone, and prayer is a personal thing. In the days of the temple, people didn't pray directly to God. They had to do it through the intermediary of the priests. So that's an incredible change. I think that an incredible change was with the Enlightenment, where certain Jews felt that they needed to fit into the world in a different way than they had before. So, and I think that we're on the edge of a new change. I think we can't do things the way we always have. I think it's not what's meaningful to me, and considering my family background and the way I was brought up, and isn't going to work with young people today. And I think that we really need to change the way we do things. And I think today, I don't know, we're on the cusp of something right now with the economy being so terrible. So on the one hand, it's terrible. We're all under such pressure at the JCC with less staff and less money, but we seem to be obsessed with trying to create exactly what we've always created. But I think maybe this will give us an opportunity to just stop for a minute and to look at the Jewish world and the Jewish world in Milwaukee and think, okay, what do people need? The best marketing plan is not, okay, I have a widget. how am I going to get people to buy that widget? But you know what? People need widgets. So I have to produce the best widget and give it to them. And I don't think we quite are there yet in the Jewish community, but I think that we're going to have to be. So, and I really think that what we come up with is going to look very different than the kind of Judaism and Jewish community that I grew up with. So I think it's actually very exciting, but we have to be forceful and we have to be sensitive to everybody and we have to be creative, and I don't think we're quite there yet. But we will be, I think we will be.
Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
I think. Well, there's so much I could go on forever, but there's nothing that really strikes, you know.
That I missed in terms of...
Well, I had made a comment about how I seem to be around for changes, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's certain points in my life where I'm really part of some kind of change. One of them was when I was much younger. I was involved with CAGE at the very beginning of CAGE, which was, those days it was called the Coalition for Alternatives in Jewish Education. It was then they changed it to Coalition for Advancement in Jewish Education. But it was kind of radical, but it really looked at the real situation of what Jewish education was. You know, we used to talk about Mrs. Schwartz. It was the fictional Mrs. Schwartz. Mrs. Schwartz is a nice lady who is a housewife, and she teaches the book of Samuel in Sunday school, and she's done it for all years and years. She's not trained as a teacher, nor is she trained as a Bible scholar. And so what can we as CAGE do to help Mrs. Schwartz be a better teacher? I think that was a big change in Jewish education. You know, the establishment was opposed to us. They said, you know, I remember the guys from the American Association for Jewish Education said, standards, you need standards. You know, you can't teach unless you know medieval Hebrew and unless you know some chapters of the Mishnah. And we said, you know what? Mrs. Schwartz is never going to know Hebrew, and she's never going to study the Mishnah, and you can't expect her to have that on her resume. She has a lot of other things to do than teaching Sunday school, but we can make her the best teacher for the book of Samuel. You know, and I think that made a huge, huge difference.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I lived in Hong Kong during the handover from England. It was a English Crown colony, from the handover to China. I'm so amazed that I was there at that sea change in history. So, you know,
was there a marked difference between pre-handover, post-handover? Or
yes, but not the one that everyone. You know, it was funny. We watched CNN like everyone else, and they kept talking about the threat to democracy. Well, I don't know who does their research at CNN, but why did they think that a British Crown colony was democratic? It wasn't democratic. It never was democratic. So there was no threat to democracy. And as a matter of fact, my Cantonese teacher, after the handover, told me she was more comfortable in Hong Kong after the handover, rather than under a colonial situation where the white people looked down on the Chinese people. And, you know, so... but what happened is not the repression that everyone in the West anyway expected, but that Hong Kong has been gradually becoming much more Chinese of a city. I mean, I go there every once in a while still, and you know, you see less English signage, the billboards and advertising, it's becoming more and more Chinese. They're putting more money into the Chinese arts rather than Western arts. You know, and there's good and bad in both of that, but you know, more now. Most young people speak Mandarin Chinese now in addition to Cantonese. They didn't so much before. So I think it's not as bad as the world seemed to characterize it as. But, you know, so I've seen a lot of changes, and I think that this change that I'm talking about in the way we look at ourselves as a Jewish community is kind of like bubbling. It's not here yet, but it's going to be in our lifetime, in my lifetime. I'm older than you. It's for sure going to be in your lifetime.
Look out for it.
Yeah.
Do anything?
I guess we've touched most of the major points.
Well, it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.